Annyeonghaseyo, Itamen Julianmida with coffee reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Obraje wash processed Colombia from Momos Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Momos, based out of Busan, South Korea. And this is their third ever appearance on this channel, having previously reviewed a couple of their coffees last year. And while I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of either of those coffees, I'd always made it a point to go back and revisit one of their higher end offerings, as I'd heard from a number of people that their higher end offerings are significantly better than their standard coffees. So when I found this at a coffee shop up in Vancouver, it felt like the perfect opportunity to revisit them. So we will see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 40. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind roast profile for this coffee. So while our previous experiences with this coffee roaster has been on the more developed side of things, I do have to say that this is the lightest coffee that I've ever had from them. And some people might align this with being on the lighter side of a medium. If not, then maybe on the slightly more developed side of that light medium. And I feel like that's kind of the best place I want to put it, as it's actually a fair bit lighter than some of the coffee roasters I've had in the United States, including places like Kuma. So hopefully that gives you a good idea. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 16, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the cup was mostly soft as there was an abundance of softer citric as well as floral aspects to the cup. In addition to that, there's a slight herbality and a bit of fresh fruit in a citric sense. However, it was marred by an ever so slight smokiness to it. Other than that, it was a pretty nice first impression, as I was definitely feeling a fair bit of the geisha-like qualities to this one. Day 19 opted for the Chemex, and once again the development is still felt, but a little bit more than typical, as it continues to offer a mostly citric forward cup with a slight fresh fruit grapefruit feel to it. It opens up as it cools down with a little bit of the grape and honeyed qualities to it, as well as a slightly bitter component as well. So experiencing a lot of things on these first couple of days, so I definitely felt like there's a fair bit of depth to this one. Day 22 opted for the April Brewer, and the cup is the most tame it's been up to this point, as it's offering a slightly delicate citric profile to it, very soft with a slight bitterness to the cup. The coriander seed felt apt. It was a very interesting note I found on this one, as there was this kind of strange savoriness that I really did not know how to describe within this coffee. That was present yet again on this day. It was present the first couple of days, but on this day I said, okay, it's actually prominent and pronounced enough to the point where I should make a note of this and kind of discuss it, because I'm not entirely sure how I can identify this, but it's just kind of unique savoriness that's not like something I've necessarily tasted either in coffee before or just in general outside of coffee. Day 25 opted for the V60 with lower temperatures, and there was a little bit of improvement as there's a little bit more clarity to the cup. It does continue to offer a fair bit of that herbality as well as that fresh fruit in that citric sense yet again. Honey quality continues to remain present in the cup with slight improvements over time, so wasn't necessarily sure if it was the adjustments we had made or just a general a general increase in the amount of time we've given this coffee. Day 28 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and there's notable improvement as it's best right off brew by offering a clean, sweet, and fresh fruit forward citric quality to it in the tangerine-like sense, so definitely experiencing a fair bit of that, we'll just say sweeter orange-like quality to it. It does cool down into a slightly more intense tropical-like aspect that was a little bit more in line with the listed papaya, but also a passion fruit, slight tea-like savoriness, but better overall, as once again, experiencing a lot in this coffee. There's a lot of depth to this one. So we move on to day 31 as we opted for the V60, as the aroma of the coffee itself continues to smell really nice, as it's offering some ripe stone fruits that's reminiscent of what I've described as being some lighter plums. It's still present in the cup, maybe not to the same extent. Tropicals seem to open up as it does cool down, with the papaya remaining present and a little bit more of a passion fruit-like feel to it. And that's the note that I kept coming back to, as just reminds me a little bit more of passion fruit, which isn't something I necessarily enjoy in terms of the tropical sense of coffee. Feels like it's just still improving with time. We move on to day 34 as we opted for the Chemex with our standard recipe. And this is when I always decided that I had a slight preference towards the V60 with this one, as it's offering a slight bit more of the roastiness as well as that heavier tropical aspect. So I feel like maybe the Chemex was accentuating those roastier qualities to this one. Slightly darker berry with some slight citric brightness as well. So kind of interesting day 34 mark. Day 37, final note we have, back through the V60, and it was back to its best with a well-defined citric aspect and a sweeter, more tangerine-like sense. There's a little bit of that fresh fruit aspect yet again, with a slight peachiness followed by the tropical berry and savory aspects of this one. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those. And we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. And I know that I mentioned that there were some ever so slight developed and smoky qualities to it, but I don't think that they were pronounced or heavy enough to the point where it was really going to take away or hinder the overall clarity of this one, especially given that the rest of the coffee was so well defined and articulated in this coffee. So I definitely feel like the level 4 was justified, but that's the best I can put for it. Maybe even on the slightly lower side of level 4, but definitely at least at that mark. Finish, level 4. And it did trail off into a much more tropical fruit sense that I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of, mostly because that passion fruit-like aspect I feel like has been ever so slightly overdone for me with a couple of coffees that we've reviewed in the past. Outside of that though, I feel like it didn't necessarily find itself hampered by too many of the long-lasting smoky or roasty qualities. Those were a little bit more subtle, especially relative to some other coffees that I've had recently, so don't have too many complaints on that. We move on to sweetness level 4. Probably the best part of this coffee and the most surprising part of this coffee for me was that it was as sweet as it was given the previous experiences I'd had with Momos. So massive credit to them on that. It definitely skewed a lot more on the citric side of things, as well as there's something else that's slightly honey quality to it as well. Florality level 4, and that's what I'd previously just mentioned, a little bit more of that floral honey sense to it. And oftentimes when it comes to Colombian geishas, I'm not entirely sure if we're going to get a very well-defined or articulated floral sense to it. Though this one I feel like was maybe a little bit more pronounced in this cup. We move on to citrus fruit level 4, and I keep mentioning that orange, like that tangerine-like citric quality to it. And yes, that was the most abundant, pronounced, and notable quality for me within this one. And while it's there at that level 4, it's mostly there at that level 4 because it was the most pronounced fruit characteristic. We'll just transition right into level 3s, beginning with those fruit components and the berry-like attribute. I mentioned that a lot of the papaya as well as the passion fruit, which both would have scored in that in that berry sense, were pronounced enough to the point where they were just going to score that level 4, but I felt like the citrus was the most dominant of those fruit components. So while that's on the higher side of the level 3, I feel like it did not reach the same level as the citric qualities within this one. So definitely pretty close, but I just wanted to mark that within this tasting wheel to demonstrate that the citrus was a little higher. Stone fruit level 3, that one's a little bit more true of a level 3, and that one can be felt in some other regards, so the plum-like attribute as well as that ever so slight peachiness to it, qualities I really enjoyed in this one, and I feel like I wanted to get more of those from this cup. Caramel level 3, and that's the slightly, we'll say, candied aspect of this coffee, which did turn out a little bit sweeter than I might have necessarily expected, so credit to them in that regard. We move on, savoriness level 3, and I mentioned that kind of off, unique, savory aspect that they had in this coffee that I still can't necessarily find a way to describe. Coriander seed, I feel like maybe that's the direction we're going, but I still don't know what that tastes like, and again, I can't necessarily pinpoint exactly what that flavor profile is. Body, level 3, and that's an interesting part of this coffee for a number of reasons, most specifically being that it is a geisha coffee, though it could be balanced out by the fact that it was brewed with the V60 and that it is still a Colombian coffee, but I fully expected that one to maybe score a little lower on this tasting wheel. Level 3, a little bit more medium-bodied cup of coffee. And then the final thing worth discussing is the acidity brightness level 3. And I think that maybe the profile of this coffee might have been at play when it came to the overall brightness of it, but I was kind of thinking it's surprising just how low the brightness is for this coffee, as I wouldn't necessarily say that it's too pronounced relative to a lot of the other much more, we'll just say, intense qualities within this coffee. It's a little bit more in that medium level at that level 3 mark, but as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. It goes without saying that this is my favorite Momos coffee that I've ever had, as I think that the slightly lighter profile relative to the other coffees I've had from them definitely helped with how much I enjoyed this coffee. In addition to that, there's a lot in this coffee, and I feel like I've only gotten, I wouldn't even necessarily say like 60-70%. There's so much in this coffee, and you can feel these aspects from time to time. And I feel like maybe one part where I struggled with this coffee is that it actually smelled a little better when I was grinding and brewing than it turned out when I was actually drinking the coffee. And that's not always the case. I'm usually able to kind of replicate the overall aroma of the whole beans and the grounds themselves to get the similar experience within the cup itself. This one was a little bit of an exception to that, as I felt like this coffee just smelled much better than it turned out in the cup itself. But that kind of goes to show that there were still more things I feel like I could have gotten from this one. So this one's pretty interesting in that sense. And that kind of transitions into the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like, I think if you do enjoy your kind of traditional geisha-like coffees, this one has so many of those aspects. Keep in mind the profile of it. It's still not necessarily going to be the lightest coffee out there, but it offers a citric forward as well as floral forward aspect to it with really nice clarity as well as really nice sweetness. So it kind of hits on the marks that I'm going for within this coffee, even if the fruit profile skewed slightly more away from the direction that I typically tend to enjoy in that fruit profile. But keep those things in mind with a little bit more body as well as, we'll just say, a toned down brightness to it. Because I feel like if you still enjoy that profile of coffee with a lot of depth to it, then I feel like this one's a really good fit for that, and also kind of the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the El Obraje wash processed Colombia from Momos Coffee. Thank you for watching.